The howling wind above resembled a far-off, muffled roar, much like an ocean imprisoned within a seashell. However, deep underground, the air was motionless and thick with the smell of moist rock and melting tallow. Ada sat with her spine pressed to the curved side of the dry well, knees pulled tight to her chest, attentive to the steady pattern of her daughter's breaths in the darkness. Half a dozen feet overhead, a barrier of frozen wood, fabric, and 2 feet of compacted snow stood between them and a world that had sought to obliterate them. On a jutting stone close to the roof, one drop of moisture collected, reflecting the dim amber light from their tiny tin oil lamp, then dropped without a sound into the earthen ground. This place was their vessel, their stronghold, their grave. Everything hinged on the air vent staying unobstructed. Ada glanced at her pocket watch, the brass chilly on her thumb. Above ground, it was the middle of the afternoon, a place where men on horseback seized territory that didn't belong to them. Yet underground, the passage of time was gauged solely by the gradual consumption of lamp oil and the stiffness in her limbs. Shutting her eyes, the moist stonework faded briefly, transporting her to that day when the heavens were vast and merciless. It all began with a notice hammered onto a wooden door. A sheriff by the name of Gentry, who carried his power as if it were a burdensome overcoat, never once met her gaze as he broke the news. The winter of 1888 had already begun to bear its fangs. Ice coated the windows of the ranch house that Ada's husband had constructed with his bare hands before succumbing to illness. The bank had no concern for diseases, poor crops, or the reality that a widow and her young daughter had no other refuge. Their only interest was in account books. Gentry had allowed them just 3 days to move out. Ada had remained on the porch, the document trembling in the harsh wind. Her gaze swept over the undulating brush-covered terrain she had struggled to domesticate for a decade. She held back tears, for, as her husband often said, crying only wasted precious moisture. In their place, a frigid, dense tightness gathered in her abdomen, a determination as unyielding as steel. Her eyes shifted between the barn that would be confiscated and the home that would be auctioned off. Next, her gaze wandered to the distant boundary of the land, close to the parched stream bed. There stood the ancient stone well, long neglected, a project from years past that had never yielded water, merely a deep, arid pit in the earth. Mama Lottie had inquired, pulling at Ada's hem, her tone shaking with that innate anxiety youngsters display when adults fall quiet. "Are we heading to town?" For them, going to town signified the poorhouse being split apart, the dissolution of their family unit. Ada gazed down at Lottie, her complexion pale and tightened from the cold. She stroked the child's hair, her palms calloused by labor, yet tender in their caress. "No, Lottie," Ada murmured, as a scheme began to take shape, grim and frightening within her thoughts. "We're not going to town. We're about to start a game, a very silent, very prolonged game of hide-and-seek." The falsehood had a metallic flavor in her mouth, yet it was essential. The world wished for their disappearance. To be brushed aside like grit, but Ada wasn't grit. She was the rock that shattered the plow. She strode to the rim of the well, looked down into the blackness, and perceived not a vacant shaft, but an opportunity. The move from above ground to below had to be executed with precision. They couldn't risk being spotted departing, nor could they be witnessed remaining inside for 2 nights while the house remained legally theirs. Ada labored beneath the concealment of a dark night sky. She crept like a burglar across her own property. The well measured 5 feet in diameter and 12 feet in depth, encased in coarse limestone that had withstood the weight of the ground for 10 years. The well was completely dry, its bottom cluttered with tumbleweeds and sand drifts. Clearing it out was the first order of business. Using a rope, Ada descended, her boots scraping along the walls. For hours, she filled buckets with rubble, then hauled them up and scattered the contents deep into the bushes to avoid leaving any telltale piles. Her shoulders ached, muscles crying out, yet fear drove her powerfully. Whenever fatigue threatened to break her, she would gaze at the glowing window of the ranch house. Lottie slept, oblivious that her mother was excavating a grave to keep her alive. Constructing the roof proved most difficult. It needed sufficient strength to bear the load of winter snow, but it had to be so low that it was undetectable from 10 paces. Ada gathered the heavy beams from the rear of the disintegrating curing shed, pulling each one over the frosty grass. She positioned them over the well opening, carefully spacing them on top of the timber, Then she spread a thick, tarred canvas that she had taken from the barn's supply loft. Though she felt the bank owed her far more, that canvas was the sole item she truly stole from them. Over the canvas she piled soil, tamping it down and leveling it to blend with the landscape. She created a trapdoor, a small square, just wide enough for her shoulders attached with leather hinges. Covered with a glued mixture of stones and dead grass, it was weighty, clumsy, and hazardous if it got stuck. If it failed, they would perish. Snow would entomb them. Yet when she stepped back, gasping, her breath forming clouds in the cold air, the well had vanished and the earth appeared untouched. They relocated the night before the deadline, carrying only essential items and survival necessities. They left behind all furniture and heirlooms, taking only blankets and the thick buffalo robe. They also brought the oil tin, dried beef, a flour sack, and the small iron pot. Lottie held her rag doll tight against her chest like a lucky charm. Ada carried the rifle and water skins. Going down into the well for the last time seemed like stepping off the world's edge. First, Ada lowered Lottie, tying the rope around her waist. "Be courageous," she murmured. "It's just a fortress, like the ones in Tales." Lottie's eyes, shining with starlight, were wide, but she nodded and slipped silently down into the darkness. As Ada followed, closing the trap door, they were engulfed in utter darkness overhead. The latch's click echoed louder than anything. They were interred, yet alive. The initial week taught them about the mechanics of suffocation and the science of heat. Ada understood that without a fire, the ground's chill would penetrate their bodies and cause death during sleep. Yet a fire would produce smoke, and smoke would reveal them. She had foreseen this problem prior to sealing the roof. She excavated a slim trench laterally from the well's top. From there, she extended a rusty stovepipe into the hollow interior of a dead cottonwood tree located 5 yards off. This gamble was a desperate act of improvisation. If the smoke became too dense, it would billow from the tree as if it were a beacon. They needed to achieve clean combustion. Ada promptly instructed Lottie in the careful management of fire. Ada whispered, "We only use the driest twigs for burning." The lamp made long, flickering shadows on the limestone walls, and they were only lit at night when darkness concealed the smoke. A routine was set, a sacred structure to their imprisonment. The area was tiny, a cylindrical living space where every bit had to be put to use. During daylight, the bedding was rolled up and placed against a wall to free up floor area. Provisions were kept in a hollow stone niche, elevated to protect from moisture and bugs. The bucket used as a toilet was a constant embarrassment and a difficult logistical issue. It needed to be securely sealed and only emptied on the very darkest evenings. Its waste was buried deep in the bushes. The air inside the well became stagnant fast, thick with the odor of their bodies and a slight oily lamp smell. Ada kept a close eye on Lottie for any illness. Although the girl was tough, the absence of sunlight made her skin pale like parchment. To fight the feeling of being trapped, Ada created activities. They tallied the stones in the wall. There were 412 inches, the lowest 3 layers. They also braided and then undid the fringe of the buffalo hide. With dried beans, Ada instructed Lottie in basic math, speaking the problem softly. "If we have 10 beef strips and we consume half a strip each day, how many days will they last?" Lottie would scowl, her tiny forehead wrinkling in the faint illumination. 20 days, Mama, correct," Ada replied, even though the result made her own gut tighten. 20 days were insignificant. Winter went on for many months. The quiet itself became the third occupant of the well. The silence was a weighty, oppressive presence. Up above, the wind could howl, but underground, the soil absorbed the sound, leaving just a faint rumble. They taught themselves to talk in hushed tones, afraid that any loud noise would travel through the earth and warn someone nearby. They acted like mice. They moved quickly in the darkness, living off tiny bits of food and constant vigilance. By the 3rd week, the mental pressure set in not suddenly, but through a gradual wearing away of patience. For Lottie, the excitement of their hideout had faded. The moisture made everything damp to the touch, and their garments never got completely dry. Lottie started to become restless, her tiny frame craving the freedom to run, leap, and see the open distance. She would position herself beneath the trapdoor, gazing up at the daylight that filtered through the gaps. She would lift her hand but never make contact with the wooden door. "Can I go outside for just a short while?" she'd inquire, her tone weak and pleading. Ada needed to become the barrier itself, and she had to be tougher than the surrounding rock. No, she would reply, not angrily but with no chance for negotiation. Mr. Gentry is outside, and so is the wolf, which means we remain in the den. It pained Ada deeply to witness the brightness fade from Lottie's gaze, to see the lively childhood spark replaced by a weary resignation. To offset that, Ada started sharing tales. These weren't the fantasy stories from printed books, but accounts of their forebears, ladies who journeyed across seas, men who constructed log houses in the snow, individuals who persevered. She reframed their hardship as a tale of resilience. "We're biding our time until the sun returns," Ada would murmur while they snuggled close for heat. "The sun is building up its power, much like we are, and when we emerge, we'll be mightier than the community, mightier than the financial institution." She caressed Lottie's hair, hoping the falsehood would endure, hoping the supplies would see them through. She wished that the thick snow piling up above wouldn't collapse the wooden supports that creaked from the burden. Then, the day arrived when the trembling altered. The sound wasn't caused by the wind. Instead, it was a heavy, rhythmic beating that was deep and echoing, vibrating through the ground and up into their backbones. Several horses, not just a single one. Ada stopped moving immediately, her hand quickly covering the lamp's flame, which threw them into complete blackness. She extended her arm in the dark, located Lottie, and drew her close, pressing the girl firmly against her while using her hand to cover Lottie's lips. The pounding sound became more intense and nearer. They were directly above them. The earth vibrated, and dust trickled from the ceiling, falling onto their skin like a fine, dry precipitation. Lottie made a soft whimper into Ada's hand, a noise so small that it seemed enormous in the quiet above. Voices, though muffled and warped by the soil, filtered down from the surface, still clearly recognizable. Scanning the area feels empty in this spot. There's a silence, then the squeaking of saddle leather and the solid thump of a boot landing on the earth immediately beside the hidden entrance. Ada held her breath, her pulse pounding so forcefully in her chest that she worried the men above might sense it via their footwear. If Gentry's black hound accompanied them, they were finished. The dog would detect the air shaft and the scent of unwashed bodies emanating from below. Ada clenched the knife handle on her belt, a pointless action, yet done without thought. She imagined the hidden door being torn away, a dazzling white light flooding in, and a gun's muzzle aimed at them. She pulled Lottie even closer, prepared to use herself as a shield. The boot dragged over the concealed door, disturbing the soil covering it. An oppressive silence lasted for what seemed like forever. Then, after a brief drift, a different voice shouted something. Far-off gusts of wind heaped sand against the ancient stream bed before moving onward. The boot moved off, and once more the leather saddle groaned. The sound of hooves started again, starting slowly, then gradually diminished as they moved away. Ada remained still, keeping her grip on Lottie. For a whole hour they stayed in the absolute darkness, dust coating their bodies as fear gradually gave way to a shaky sense of safety. They felt like phantoms, completely unseen. Yet they were also confined, with life on the surface moving directly above them. When Ada eventually reignited the lamp, her hands trembled so violently that she fumbled and dropped the match twice. The flame burst into existence, revealing Lottie's cheeks covered in tears. "Has the wolf left?" Lottie asked, in a hushed voice. Ada gave a nod, unable to speak because her throat felt constricted. She glanced upward at the thick wooden beams. For the moment, they were secure. However, winter had only just started, and the food stored in the hollow was already appearing insufficient. Ada understood at that moment that cold and darkness weren't their sole adversaries. What posed the biggest danger was the burden, the never-ending, exhausting anticipation for a spring that might never arrive. She drew the buffalo hide more snugly around both of them. "Let's count the stones one more time, Lottie," she said gently. "Begin from the lowest one." In the weeks after that near disaster, the atmosphere became thick. Yet what endangered them now wasn't the pressure from the sheriff's footsteps. It was the heaviness of things unseen. Ada observed this initially in the oil lamp's flame. It had stopped flickering. Rather, the tiny orange tongue remained completely motionless, contracting in on itself and taking on a pale blue hue at its root. Lottie slept more frequently, her breaths coming in rapid, shallow gasps. Upon waking, she navigated through a headache as thick as molasses, causing her to moan each time she turned her head. Ada shared the sensation, a persistent, dull pressure behind her eyes, and a weariness that made lifting an arm feel like raising a heavy sack of grain. The culprit was the vent. The heavy snow from the prior night likely had shifted, or a sheet of ice might have sealed the hollow cottonwood trunk that functioned as their air passage. They were gradually being suffocated by their own exhalations. The realization struck Ada with the force of a physical impact, instantly pulling her from her daze. If the lamp extinguished, oxygen was depleted, and they would simply fall into an endless sleep. Ada saw Lottie curled tightly beneath a buffalo robe and understood she must climb. Scaling the well's interior was nothing like climbing a ladder. The footholds were jagged stones, slippery with moisture, and the cold had rendered Ada's joints as stiff as rusted hinges. To conserve the last remnants of clean air, she killed the lamp, thrusting the well into complete, suffocating darkness. She relied solely on touch, her fingers scrabbling over the limestone. She located the familiar knot she had memorized while building. Each upward pull was a fight against gravity and the disorienting effects of the unbreathable air. Her heart pounded wildly, skipping beats against her ribs. At 10 feet up, then 11, her head met the rough wooden ceiling. She extended her hand, searching for the base of the stovepipe where it angled into the earth. The touch revealed it was intensely cold, freezing against her skin. With trembling hands, she detached the pipe, causing a shower of soot to coat her face, invisible in the dark but tasting of ash. She drove her arm into the horizontal tunnel she had dug, reaching toward the tree stump. Her fingers encountered a solid mass of packed ice and debris. The passage was completely obstructed. Panic flared fiercely. Up here, she had no tools, only her bare hands. She sank her fingernails into the blockage, scraping at frozen earth and ice, tearing her skin while ignoring the pain. She had to crack the seal. She struck it with the heel of her hand once, twice, in a frantic, silent pounding. Suddenly, the obstruction gave way. A blast of air, shockingly cold and carrying scents of pine and fresh snow, surged into the tunnel, and Ada gasped. She filled her lungs with the freezing draft, her head spinning from the sudden rush of oxygen. In the darkness below, she heard Lottie stir and cough. The air was circulating again. The passage was unobstructed. By late January, the cold had evolved into a living entity, a predator lurking in the stone walls. They awaited the moment the fire would die out. The wood reserve was critically low. They had burned every piece of debris from the well's bottom and every twig Ada had stored in the niche. Now they were burning the shovel's handle, feeding it into the small stove in thin splinters. Lottie's fever struck during the night, irradiating warmth from her small body that seemed to mock the freezing air around them. Beneath the covers, she flailed and rambled about the creek, the horses, and other non-existent things. Ada offered a cup of melted snow to Lottie's dry lips, yet the girl turned aside, her gaze blank and distant. The dread of the sickness surpassed the fear of the sheriff. Gentry could merely end their lives. The fever might claim Lottie while Ada remained stuck in this pit, a much more dreadful outcome. Ada examined the recess. The brown glass bottle filled with laudanum and willow bark extract was completely empty. The final drops had been used weeks earlier to soothe a toothache. Warmth was essential to break the fever. However, the stove sat cold, and the darkness was total. Ada came to a choice that seemed insane. She would avoid going into town. That would be certain death. Yet she recalled the fence rows, the aged cedar poles indicating the pasture's edge half a mile westward. Cedar blazed fiercely and quickly. Venturing out meant risking exposure and leaving Lottie unattended. But the alternative was to witness the cold silence her daughter's heartbeat. Ada murmured to the feverish girl, "I'll return soon." Pulling the robe snugly around herself, she added, "I'm off to capture the sun for you." She climbed the wall with practiced, smooth motions, yet forcing open the trapdoor demanded such a strain in her shoulders that her sight grew fuzzy. She stepped out into a glaring white landscape, illuminated by a full moon that made the snow appear like a silver blanket. The icy wind sliced through her worn-out coat as sharply as a blade. She kept herself low, slithering on her stomach across the frozen snow, resembling a grazing creature. Each shadow took on a human shape, and every breeze's whisper seemed like someone speaking. Arriving at the fence border with numb fingers, she started to wiggle the first post free. The earth was as hard as iron. She needed to strike the post with her foot, swaying it to and fro while the noise carried precariously through the cold atmosphere. Eventually, it broke. She hauled the 4-foot piece of dried cedar behind her, creating a path in the snow that must be erased before daybreak. The way back became a haze of adrenaline and numbing agony. Upon descending once more into the well and closing the hatch, the stillness of the ground engulfed her. With trembling hands, she scraped shavings from the cedar with her knife and lit a match. The flames ignited. The well was soon filled with the pungent, comforting aroma of burning cedar, evoking a sense of home. Heat climbed painstakingly degree by degree. Lottie's shivering ceased. Ada sat near the stove, observing the fire while grasping the knife, anticipating a dawn she couldn't witness. February represented a time of emptiness. Time lost its meaning. There were no distinct mornings or evenings, merely intervals of sleep and intervals of anticipation. Rationing food had turned into a cruel calculation. A single strip of jerky was partitioned into 3 portions, one for Lottie, one for Ada, and one reserved for days ahead. Constant hunger plagued them. This craving transcended mere discomfort, evolving into an eerie, empty-headed clearness. Ada would often lose herself in hours of gazing at the limestone wall. While following the fossilized outlines of old shells, she pictured the sea that once blanketed this region. She told herself that if fish could withstand the ocean's depths, she could endure the earth's weight. Lottie no longer inquired about the world beyond and had ceased her games with the beans. She spent the majority of each day lying still to save strength, her gaze following the shifting shadows. The daylight traveled across the air vents high overhead. They had turned into hibernating beings, with their pulses decelerating and their requirements trimmed down to the absolute minimum to prevent mental decay. Ada started instructing Lottie on the ranch's plan based on recollection, not its past state, but its future form. "Shut your eyes," Ada repeated, her voice hoarse from lack of use. "Step outside the front entrance, then go left. What's in sight?" Lottie would softly say the large oak, but Ada would kindly adjust. "The oak is no more. We've put in an apple orchard, red varieties." In the darkness, they constructed a realm. They sowed seeds that would never sprout and erected barriers that would never require repair. This collective delusion was their method for bringing structure to a disordered world. Yet the quiet was gradually wearing them down. One afternoon, Ada caught a voice that didn't belong to Lottie. It was her spouse's tone, ringing clearly, summoning her from the well's rim. "Ada, fetch some water." She rose, her heart jumping, but then reality struck. Nobody was there, only the wind howling through the air shaft. She sank her teeth into her lip until it drew blood. The acute ache kept her anchored. "We are here," she declared loudly, her tone fierce within the cramped area. "We remain here." She compelled Lottie to sit upright and insisted she consume the remaining cloudy water. "Tally the rocks," she ordered. "Say them out loud." Lottie's voice came out faint, like a slender blade of grass in a breeze. 1, 2, 3. Only the numerals remained as genuine. The melt came without heat, carried by noise starting as a regular ticking, akin to a timer winding down. It then picked up speed into a continuous, unyielding drip. The overhead snow was many layers thick and densely compacted. The ground, icy for ages, was liquefying and couldn't soak it up quickly. The well, built for retaining water, recalled its function. Their dwelling's floor transformed into mire, and eventually into watery sludge. Ada woke up feeling chilly water seeping into her stockings. A cold, piercing terror struck her chest at the thought of the water climbing too high. They'd be compelled upward, toward the hatch, toward the daylight and its perils. They started piling all their essentials. The blankets, the final bits of provisions. The metal container of seeds was relocated to the topmost ledges, or heaped atop the wobbly stove framework. They survived balanced on the leftover rocks, similar to birds in a waterlogged nest. The humidity was all-encompassing. It infiltrated their garments, their tresses, their flesh. The odor was that of soaked soil and decomposing fabric. Yet the thaw signified another thing. The path was unobstructed. The quiet from overhead altered its nature. The winter wind's sharp, solitary whistle gave way to the gentler, damp noises of spring. Mud pulled at the hubs, and wagon wheels groaned. Ada listened as the town stirred back to life. A wagon rolled past, the driver yelling at his mules. The ground was pudding soft. A man shouted, "The bank won't squeeze a crop out of this mud pit this year." Ada held her breath, her fingers tightening on Lottie's shoulder. The bankers spoke of the land as though it were lifeless, a failed investment. They were unaware that the ranch's heart pulsed 6 feet under their feet. Icy, black water climbed to their ankles. For 2 days they stood on stacked rocks, unable to sit, clinging together for warmth while the water table settled. This was the ultimate trial. Winter had attempted to freeze them. Hunger had tried to empty them, and now the earth sought to drown them. Yet the water halted just inches beneath the stove's firebox. It lingered, trembling with the world's passing vibrations, then slowly and painfully began to retreat. Their emergence was not a triumphant fanfare, but a blinding, agonizing rebirth. Enough water had receded to reveal a floor of slippery mud, but all supplies were lost. No oil remained. The food had turned to dust. The moment had come. Ada awaited the moonless darkness, exactly as she had when they first went in. She lifted the trapdoor, cracking the mud and grass seal that rained dirt upon them. The incoming air was sweet, fragrant with wet sage and fresh grass, heady and overwhelming. Ada emerged first, her muscles shaking, her body feeling light and unfamiliar after months of imprisonment. Then she helped Lottie climb out. Lottie appeared ghost-like, gaunt, and pallid, her eyes enormous in her face. They stood at the well's rim, trembling in the chilly spring air. The ranch house stood dark, its windows resembling vacant eyes. The barn had partially collapsed beneath the weight of snow. The landscape appeared battered and gnawed by winter. They did not approach the house. It no longer belonged to them. The records stated as much, but those records were unaware of their existence. Ada grasped Lottie's hand, sensing the delicate bird-like bones under her skin. They moved past the house and the vacant corral, heading for the tree line where the wilderness started. They had endured the annihilation. No longer were they the widow and orphan subject to a sheriff's intimidation or a banker's eviction. They had become something different, earthly beings hardened by darkness, bearing winter within them as a weapon. Ada glanced back at the well, just once the concealed maw that had devoured them and then released them alive. Now it was merely a hole in the earth. She faced the mountains, where snow remained thick but the air felt unbounded. "Let's walk, Lottie," she murmured, her tone calm and firm. The narrator speaks, having completed a single chapter, though the story continues. There remains a long journey. Still, we stand on firm earth. They stepped beneath the tree canopy, leaving no footprints on the dense mud that the sun would turn to stone by dawn.